Hey Jesper, very nice to meet you again. Welcome to the virtual studio.
Thank you. Happy to be in the virtual studio.
Before we kick things off and with all things automotive, data, AI, would you mind just giving us a little bit of context to who you are and some of your previous professional experience?
Sure. So thank you for having me. My name is Jesper Fredriksson. I'm located in Stockholm, Sweden, and I started my sort of professional career within research and development, specifically around medical imaging. I actually started with brain images. Super fun to connect back to artificial intelligence, to connect back to human intelligence. So I worked with that field for quite some time in many different aspects, both from looking at images and analyzing them, and then looking at the machines that generated those images and understanding what is good quality in those images. Then I moved over to data science around the big data hype and worked with data science, machine learning in a few different settings. First a TV company, and then Lifesum, a health app. And then I got into the automotive sector through a startup that was formed from Volvo Cars, but it was a standalone company doing car sharing called Volvo On Demand. And then recently the company was moved into Volvo Cars, and I saw the opportunity to work within generative AI specifically, which became a large passion in my life a couple of years ago when ChatGPT launched. Then I started up a new team for doing generative AI within commercial digital within Volvo Cars. So that's where I'm at right now.
No, fascinating. Thank you so much for the overview. Super interesting career progression.
Mhm.
Which leads me to one of my first questions around the sort of umbrella term of AI. We, of course, hear quite a lot of buzz from all sorts of stakeholders, industry players around AI and specifically Gen AI. Now, from your perspective, having worked in this domain, coming from a research background for many years, what has changed over the past sort of 2 to 3 years with the rise of Gen AI as opposed to especially the traditional machine learning work that we've been doing for, in many cases, decades?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a totally new field, and yet not. It becomes much more software engineering is the sort of, and all the most of the practices that were built up during machine learning and data science are sort of less important now, but there are some aspects that are important. For example, evaluations of the task that you want to perform. So there are elements from the data science and machine learning era, but this whole thing about training a model is much less important now. Fine tuning is rarely done, and when it's done, it's hard, but it's only the last few percentage points in my experience. So it's much more about calling an API or using local models, often through an API, and then doing software engineering on top of that, building products.
First of all, thank you for this perspective. Let's break this down a little bit more, maybe starting with some of the use cases, and then we delve into some of the technicalities of that. What are some of the Gen AI use cases that you have been maybe working on yourself or you've seen other industry peers are currently exploring?
There are a small set of typical use cases that one finds in more or less all over the industry, I would say. So customer support is like maybe the first place where people usually go because it handles a lot of information, and you typically bring in a database, often these kind of vector databases where you can store embeddings, which makes it easier to look up semantically what is relevant to a question that comes in, for example, from a user. So that we've been doing in Volvo Cars, working on in that angle a lot. So that's one of the main categories, I would say. Then there's a lot of automation aspects, so things that humans can do, which involves taking in some kind of information and making some kind of decision, or maybe enhancing decision making using information. So I worked a lot in the analysis field, like analytics, So enabling users to make maybe product decisions, other decisions using data in an automated fashion can be done. And almost a subdomain within this field is text to SQL. Often you have a case where you have data analysts serving some stakeholders, typically product people. And I've been working quite a lot with enabling those users to do real natural language, I should say, natural language questions, translating them to SQL, and then sending that SQL to a database and getting an answer back. So that's, you could say that it's a special case of the information processing thing. So those are, I would say, some of the main things. Then we have, of course, the content creation part, which is almost a separate field. I tend to not look so much at using content creation, but it is fascinating. I've spent some time in it, but I haven't looked into any use cases. But there are these many variations on top of this. So you could do like sales spots, for example, where you can explore. We've been working with exploring is this particular car the right car for you, and then you can talk to a bot and finding out those things. So those are some of the typical use cases. I think I'm forgetting a few. Maybe you can fill out if you have anything on top of your mind.
No, that's super interesting. So from my perspective, manufacturers are across the value chain exploring a lot, and almost think about this as sort of a little bit of a matrix in terms of sort of low risk, simply low reward, medium uncertainty, medium reward, and then sort of the higher category. And currently it feels like we're still very much sort of in this first quadrant, maybe transitioning a little bit into the second by doing lots of sort of RFP generation type of work, maybe reasonably simple chatbots. Lots of organizations work with companies like Microsoft implementing from a sort of data and architecture standpoint safe versions of a chatbot. Just sort of building on that, are there any use cases that you would really like to implement or see players in the industry implementing in the future that we currently either can't for technical reasons or just sort of didn't get to yet from sort of an effort and resource allocation standpoint?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of low-hanging fruit, and sometimes the low-hanging fruit are more difficult to reach than they should be. It all depends on what kind of data you have available and integrating to different systems. I think that's one of the blockers, I would say, to, for example, I would like to have at Volvo something that can integrate to all the information systems we have and just give me all the material that's related to some concept that we're working on. Because in a large company, there's often the case that if you're working on something, there's somebody else far away in the organization that does something similar. So it would be beautiful to have something like that. So, for example, we use a lot of Notion. Other parts of the company use a SharePoint site, and connecting across all these different systems and finding the relevant information to something, that would be a brilliant use case, I think. I forgot to mention before something that's super interesting also around typical use case related to this text to SQL, of course, coding. That's one of my use cases that I follow up the most. I think that's one of the use cases that's been profitable very early on. GitHub Copilot was the first big business, I think, within generative AI, and something that people have used a lot. And nowadays we have even more advanced tools in Cursor, for example, and there are many of these systems that either work as a copilot or more in an agentic fashion where you more say what you want and then the software builds software for you. That's also super interesting use case. Not so much underutilized, but I think there's still a lot of potential that we haven't reached yet, considering, for example, the O3 model that OpenAI announced just before Christmas as an early Christmas present, where if you interpret their benchmarks, it seems now that AI is better than most people at coding, which is quite interesting.
On this sort of lighthouse initiative or holy grail almost of an LLM solution that we referred to earlier, where we've got a form of ChatGPT, Gemini, Microsoft Copilot that is able to access company internal data assets. What are I think everyone would love to have something like that, given that, I mean, probably similar to yourself, I spend probably 89% of my day on Teams calls, either trying to get information or make a form of decision, both of which these types of solutions are much better than we are as humans. What are the barriers to developing and then scaling a solution like this today from your perspective?
Yeah, I think in that case, I think the models are very good. They can do the processing. It's more around the integrations that's the problem. So one problem is just connecting all these different subsystems. There's some progressions there. For example, Anthropic released something called Model Context Protocol, which is a protocol for how to interact with different systems. You could view it as something like the HTTP for agents. How do you communicate between different systems? Otherwise, you need to make an integration for every different system. But if you could have one integration that always does the Notion thing and something that always does the SharePoint thing, then this could be scaled much more easily. So I'm looking forward to having the sort of the infrastructure around this in place, because the models are quite good, I would say, in summarizing information. There's one part that's still a bit tricky that I thought initially would be easily solved. So when and it comes back to one of the typical use cases are around the RAG paradigm, or the retrieval-augmented generation. It seemed in the beginning that this is so powerful, and you can always find something that's semantically related to the concept that you're working with. For example, if you we had the case of just implementing a Slack bot that can answer frequently answered questions. So there's maybe a channel on Slack where you ask questions about, let's say, analytics, and we have a project integrating a platform called Amplitude, and then people want to know how is the progression of this project, and then it's more difficult than it should be, I think, to find Amplitude, because and this is my hypothesis, it's just a special case of the thing that I want to get to, that Amplitude is a concept. It's like it's something within the amplitude of a signal, for example. But then you have to differentiate the amplitude of a signal as one concept to amplitude as a system that is called amplitude, which is an interesting sort of problem around finding the relevant documents for this Slack bot that would find the correct documents to put into the context and answer the question in Slack. What is the status of the Amplitude project? And it's still not super easy to find the best articles to use for solving that problem. So the retrieval in that case is a little bit of a bottleneck. It can often be worked around by finding hybrid solutions, maybe a keyword search combined with semantic search. But it hasn't progressed as much as I would have hoped initially, because it seemed like this is super easy, and then you find all these corner cases and you spend a lot of the time just working around those corner cases.
No, that's fascinating. Building on this and zooming out a little bit for individuals listening to this that haven't necessarily worked hands-on on these types of GenAI use cases, what does the high-level architecture look like in terms of internal data assets, systems, and then external partners?
We could start from the retrieval-augmented generation, which is like the bread and butter of GenAI applications. So it means that the first step is to have something like ChatGPT or whatever, where you can ask questions to it. And that works beautifully when I have a problem that I want to solve in my day-to-day life. You can often get a response from ChatGPT, but you want to ground it into your organization and have access to the knowledge that is present in my particular use case within my organization. So then you want to have as good context as possible to just throw into the chat with ChatGPT, more or less. So that's the enhancement that makes answers more reliable because it's grounded in facts, and it makes the hallucination problem less problematic, and it just gives better responses. And the solution to that is just to find the relevant documents using some kind of search in a database or in files or whatever. It could also be what I talked about before, going to Notion and fetching through an API the relevant documents from something in another system. So you ask your question, and then you sort of do a search in some kind of space of documents. And you take the documents, throw them into the prompt as if it were ChatGPT. Just do cut and paste, but you do it programmatically. And then you can get a better answer because you ground it in these documents that you already have as facts. Is that a reasonably good picture?
No, it does make a lot of sense. From your experience, what are some of the challenges associated with it from a data standpoint in organizations?
Yeah, good question. I would say that the challenges were different than what I thought when I started with this. So, for example, in the text-to-SQL case that I mentioned, we started out in this, I mentioned this car sharing company that was part of it, was then moved into sort of the larger organization. And in that case, the data was ready and it was beautifully structured. It had been done relatively recently, so there was a lot of focus on the whole structuring of data from ingestion from the backend or wherever the data would come from, and then in an event-based manner filtered into data marts that users can consume. So everything is structured in a good way. And the stakeholders were hungry for data and ready to work with that. So it quickly got a lot of traction, this product. But then when you move it into a large organization, there's a lot of different stages of data readiness, and sometimes the data is in better or worse shape, but the heterogeneity is so large. So that proved to be a much bigger obstacle than I thought. Both the data readiness and the organization readiness for the applications in mind. So that was the big aha moment, that it's not the technical things that are difficult within Gen AI. It's more the groundwork that needs to be in a good place. And also you find yourself in change management, because sometimes you need to, in order for your product to work, you need to get people to work in a little bit different way than they're used to. And maybe they don't see the point of doing that. So that's a whole different area to work in. It's fascinating to stumble into doing many different things than what I thought initially.
That's fascinating. Sort of a follow-up question on both of them, starting with the data readiness part. Are there any sort of recommendations, if you would have a sort of, I guess, infinite resource almost to solve that problem in an organization? What would be your recommendations to improve the data readiness to enable Gen AI use cases on a larger scale?
Yeah, good question. There are many answers to this. I've spent a lot of time trying to think about this. There's one thing of just doing the groundwork, focusing on being able to access the data and working with data. You need to have these things in place, but it also helps to have some kind of buy-in from leadership. If you find yourself in the uncomfortable place where you need to change how people work, then it helps to have this buy-in, that somebody at the top says that this is important. Gen AI is transformative and we want to be at the forefront, etc. That is key to being able to change, as in all change management. So those are like the two axes, I would say. Then there's another axis around how to build a team that can do this. I mentioned that I jumped into the data science field around big data, and then the typical way to attack this was to hire a lot of data scientists, and then you think that everything will be fine, because obviously they know data science and they should know how to work with big data and machine learning. But you often find that there are many more competencies needed than just analyzing data and being good at math and maybe coding. So I mentioned before this thing about software development. That's super important, but you also need other skills. So I've been talking to a few different companies and organizations within mainly Sweden, and it was fascinating to see, for example, the what's it called in English, the pension authority, like the governmental agency that handles pension, and they were forward-looking enough to have some kind of service designer within the Gen AI team. So they had a data scientist. They managed to get a software engineer to jump in, and they also had a service designer. So it's just like regular product development, and having all these different skills needed to do product development is, I'd say, critical to succeed in the Gen AI initiative. So those are some of the axes. I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of them, but I spent a lot of time trying to understand this space.
No, that's super fascinating. Just on the sort of last aspect of stakeholders and team setup, just thinking about some of the Gen AI use cases you've either worked on or seen in your organization or the wider industry, what is sort of a typical, I know it's sort of a little bit of a lot of questions in respect, but sort of a typical setup of a team that would deliver a Gen AI use case like that in terms of number of individuals externally and internally, and then in terms of the types of capabilities that are involved?
I think I've been through most of them. So I think it's often easy to start with a small team. It's not a good thing to bring in 20 people into one space and try to grow it from there. A small team of, I would say, like six people is a good sort of moment of inertia. You need somebody with the data science hat because of these things I said, evaluations of the test cases you need to have in place to keep check of that everything is sort of working. So that's needed. Software engineering is super important because we're building systems that are not notebooks, but something that should be always on and ready to serve at all times. You need to maintain it. You need to have maintainable code. So that's one of the key players. And then there's something around product that I realized that is super critical. And those three different competencies can cover a lot of the ground, I think. So I come from the data science end. For me, product can be anything from like a UX designer, it can be the product manager, or there's many different aspects to it, like just doing the design of things and the usual things that you would have in a product team. I'd say is a good sort of thinking metaphor for generative AI. I think it's a good frame of mind to think that we're developing products. What do you need to develop products?
That's very encouraging to hear from someone with a very technical background as a product manager myself.
Yeah.
That there's a perceived value. Just on the aspect of stakeholder management, which seems to be quite critical. You mentioned senior buy-in, and there needs to be, I guess, some form of funding model associated with it. From your experience, have you seen any good examples of creating this excitement and buy-in from senior leaders in organizations? And if so, how did they achieve that?
I think either it comes from the top, and that's not so unusual because there's a lot of focus on AI today. So that's one way of it working. The other way is just showing value. At the end of the day, and there's a lot of focus on proving value today. If you can show that you've delivered something that has impact on the bottom line, then I think people will start to listen, especially under the umbrella of generative AI.
Yeah.
But I think so. That's one way of doing it, and the other way is sort of a grassroots movement where you have like hack days to find these use cases, and then looking critically at all the initiatives you have and selecting the ones that have the most potential. I think that's one way of going. So it's either from the top or you build something from the bottom.
On this aspect of value, this is something that I just naturally, given the type of work I do, spend quite a bit of time on. As far as you can talk about this, how do you usually create business cases for these initiatives? While you think about that, sort of a little bit of context to this question is that from my experience and observation, especially with these Gen AI use cases, lots of these metrics can be a little bit hard to quantify, so either have impact on customer experience and things like that, which are inherently hard to articulate in value realistically, or internal processes around employee efficiency, unless you're sort of firing someone, which you usually don't do, just from experience, for good reason as well, by making their work more efficient and or pleasant. There isn't really a sort of clear route to value for some of these initiatives that are arguably still quite important. So just, playing this back to you with a little bit of sort of rambling along, from your experience, how do you create business/value cases for Gen AI initiatives?
Yeah, it's a super good question, and something that I've also struggled with. And I think I'm getting a little bit closer to how to think about it. I'm now at the point where I'm thinking of KPIs on in like two different levels. So one level is like the immediate level is just looking at more or less some kind of work equivalent. Like, for example, I have one case which is processing free text comments from users. So in one case where we were doing this, there was actually a person looking through all the comments that come in a relatively narrow field. Then it's actually possible to look at all the cases, so we can see how long does it take for this person to do this job, and then we can see, okay, now we run it through automatically. We can prove that we're doing a good enough job of replicating the human operator doing this, and then it's easy to say, okay, we're saving this many hours, and then it's like it's amount of work or money in the end that we're saving on this. Then you can of course say that, well, we need to make sure that person spends those hours doing something meaningful, but that's something I'm not going into. But it's at least some metric that we're doing something to make operation more efficient. But then comes the next question. So we're delivering these insights based on these free text comments, and if we deliver them to product and they're not looking at it, then there's no use in doing it. I'm now starting to look at sort of a second level of KPIs where we want to see maybe tie the amount of comments that come in some kind of category, and see if we can tie this to initiative that has been going on where we're trying to reduce some kind of friction or increase customer satisfaction. Then we can look at how have these numbers improved in terms of free text comments. I'm mentioning this and having a negative sentiment, or you get the point. So then we can see that we can actually prove something about what's happening in the business, going towards customer satisfaction maybe. In this case, it could also be saving hours in the end. Sometimes it's just about replacing manual work that's tedious. It could also be the case that we can cover more areas. In this case, it's I mentioned that there's a narrow space where we can look at all the comments. Sometimes we can't look at the comments, and it's too much. And we can now serve a larger part of the business. So then the KPI would be something like the number of areas covered for this. So that's sort of roughly where I'm moving towards in looking at value. So some kind of first level KPIs, and maybe having a second level KPI as well.
No, that's super interesting and clear. On this sort of last aspect around user feedback, for these types of Gen AI solutions, how do you usually gather user feedback and see whether what you developed is meeting their expectations?
So are we talking about if it's doing a good job?
Yeah, essentially once you've sort of delivered, whether it's an earlier stage of a proof of concept or a minimum viable product, or a product that has been scaled and productionized and launched on a larger scale, are there any sort of means that you implement to gather feedback from whoever the stakeholder may be, depending on the type of product that's using it, to ensure that it essentially does what they expected it to do, or that it's useful to them?
Yeah. So what I try to do is to establish some kind of baseline. Like in this narrow field, it was easy because there was somebody sitting and doing this, and then we can just compare that what we get out sort of correlates to this. It is a tricky field because there's not one way of sorting these comments, but you want it to at least correlate, and you want it to be close enough to what the human does. And in this case, where we were looking at something where where there wasn't anybody doing the analysis, then we have to take a subset and establish some kind of baseline for what we should do, and then continually, of course, monitor this. So, and that goes back to what I said before about evals and this thing about having this data science mindset of we have something that we know is true in some sense, or something that we want to correlate against. And as the product evolves, we have to make sure that this is not decreasing, that the metric is going down. So it's about monitoring and logging these things. So it's mainly making sure that we are doing something that makes sense and then communicating that to the stakeholder.
As a final question from my side, sort of overarching and consolidating lots of these different issues we've covered today, you mentioned that you're speaking to the Chief Data and AI Officer at one of the incumbent automotive manufacturers, whether it's Volvo Cars or any other one. From your experience, what would be your top 3 recommendations to deliver these Gen AI initiatives in a sustainable, value-adding way?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to what I said before, that there is some readiness aspect to it that needs to be sort of verified. That what kind of use cases do we have, and what are the sort of the requirements for those use cases to perform. It seems easy, but it's like you have to start with doing something, because otherwise you don't know. It's hard to assess data readiness without going in and doing something. Then you find the actual problems. So I would say something like hack days, for example, is something that we've been working a bit with, and it seems to be a very good vehicle for doing this small investments in time. It seems to deliver a lot of value in this first stage. So something like that, to have activities where you continually educate the organization in working with these things. So that's sort of a benefit of doing this mapping in a learning by doing way. So you learn about your readiness by doing things. And the hack day seems to be one vehicle, or you can have many different versions of that. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is, as I said before, to connect the leadership level into this, and that can be done, as I said, either by going from bottom up through these initiatives, or by just telling them that this is what's happening right now, and showing what's going on in the industry. So to connect those levels. And then we talked about the skill set in the team. That's a super important topic as well.
Brilliant.
Anything I'm missing out? Did I forget anything?
No, I think in terms of sort of the essence of some of the biggest pain points that we see across industry players, that definitely covers it. I think data is one that comes up pretty much every time I speak to someone, and then yes, sort of senior leadership buy-in, and then collaboration with also senior stakeholders across the different functions, super important. And then capability, also around sort of what types of capabilities to internalize versus externalize it's a big one. So we cover some important points there. Thank you so much, Jesper. It's been a real pleasure. Sorry, anything else you wanted to add?
It's been super fun and interesting to sort of recollect all the experiences I've had.
No, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.